everybody. I'm tired. It's been a long day. I was looking for a response. I appreciate that. I'm Dr. Stan. I'm the organizer of the Cybersecurity Seminar Series. Thanks for coming. Really appreciate it. Today I'm really excited to welcome Heather West to our campus. Heather has a degree in computer science and cognitive science and almost went to law school, but didn't. She has been a policy strategist at Mozilla, Google, Meta, and Cloudflare, and now works as an advisor to many organizations, including Hacking Policy Council, where she acts as the translator between engineers, hackers, and policy folks. She is a hacker, but reluctantly admits it, despite the fact that she's gone to DEF CON for nearly 15 years. Right. I first met Heather in 2011 and instantly hated her. We argued viciously about privacy until it became clear that our goals were actually the same. And then we set off to save the world. That didn't work. But Heather is still working on saving the world. And she's here to talk about offensive cybersecurity and how that might play a part. So please help me in welcoming Heather West.
Thank you. Yes, Sid and I were in the trenches on some of these really interesting privacy questions around do not track and some of the things it has evolved into. So yes, I am here today to talk about offensive security policy with some pirates. You will note that the AI art is mostly pirates because it turns out if you tell Stability AI that you want pirates, it listens and never stops. So there's a lot of pirates. But I work, as Sid said, with a lot of organizations on cybersecurity, AI, and privacy policy, product strategy. I'm really lucky. It's incredibly interesting work. And so when we were talking about what I could come talk about here, I wanted to do something that is developing. I live in Washington, D.C. I work with governments around the world, and this is one that people are starting to talk about a fair bit. It is not settled. I am open to questions, thoughts, comments, suggestions. Tell me there's too many pirates. Cool. So I'm here a little bit with my hat from the Hacking Policy Council. Hacking Policy Council is a group of companies who are interested in vulnerability discovery, disclosure, management, protecting security research. And so the idea that your good faith hackers can go out and figure out how to make things safer. There are protections in place. Some of the tools around penetration testing, red teaming, threat intel, defensive tooling, as well as some of the industry that serves those needs. So Hacking Policy Council generally works at that intersection of hacking and policy, even though, as we will see, that can be something of a mismatch. So there is a really interesting mismatch here between cybersecurity and policy, and that's the place that I live and work. My professional biography says I'm a translator. As Sid said, I try to make sure that the engineers and the hackers and the policymakers understand each other. I'm rarely the expert in the room, but I just want to make sure the experts can talk to each other, which means I adore conferences like DEF CON because it brings together all of these different people from different parts of the world who are in different parts of the world geographically, but also substantively, to talk about some of these things and share ideas. And it's I don't know, it's a really fun conference. I help coordinate the policy at DEF CON group to put on some talks around topics like these. So if at some point y'all want to go to DEF CON, it's kind of great. So I want to talk about this mismatch between cybersecurity and policy before we really dive into the discussion of the day on offensive security. There's a real tension and mismatch between the technical domain of cyber and the institutional domain of policy. Cybersecurity is new and mysterious. There's a mystique to it. You look at Hollywood and how hackers are portrayed, and they're off in a corner and it's dark and they're making magical things happen, right? And we all know that's not exactly what we're doing here. There's a lot of not magic that happens to make it look good. but the technologies evolve really rapidly. People don't necessarily understand them, especially when we're talking about policymakers. They're a little scared of them. And the information available about cybersecurity and operations can be limited. Cybersecurity is dual use. We're going to talk about that a little bit, and what that means in the policy world is it can be used for good things and bad things, offensive things, defensive things, civilian things, military things. And so most of cybersecurity really feels pretty dual use, and so talking about the tools and the techniques and the operations can be difficult. It's asymmetric. One lone mysterious hacker, if we're going to go with the Hollywood version, in a hoodie, can cause incredibly broad impact, right? It's asymmetric. One person with very few resources can do something quite impressive, and they can do it without borders, right? We did not architect the internet to be border aware. That is changing a little bit with some of the protocols, but I can sit here in Terre Haute and impact all sorts of interesting things around the world, or be impacted by all sorts of interesting actors from around the world. It's a little unpredictable. It's moving so quickly that we don't really know what's happening. Exploits leak, payloads mutate, things get used for things that we didn't really design them for. And it's often ad hoc. It is running around, slapping patches on things, trying to figure out what's going on. And that's really, really different than policy, right? We've got a bunch of people in suits sitting around having very, very process-oriented discussions, sometimes disjointed, but they want to bring all these stakeholders to the room and understand how to move things forward. It's designed to move slowly. It's intended to be symmetric. One actor is not intended to have massively different power than another. It is border-bound. Jurisdiction matters, potentially more than almost anything else. It's predictable-ish. We want it to be predictable. Sometimes we don't accomplish that from a policy perspective. And it's precedential. What happened before matters a lot and shapes what happens next. So you see here that there's kind of a mismatch of tempo, of scope, of logic, and we're trying to jam them together and think through some really hard questions. It's not theoretical. It really, when you're thinking about cybersecurity, how many folks in here pay attention to policy generally? Like what governments are saying about hackers and cybersecurity and security research, and there's a mismatch, right? You'll see all of these videos, some member of Congress goes up and tries to say something really smart about cybersecurity. And there's a nugget there. They really are trying, but they just don't even have the vocabulary, and they don't really understand what they're impacting. They have a lot of really smart people who are telling them what they can do and how to help, but that can be fairly difficult. All right, so what is offensive cybersecurity? Cybersecurity is generally conceived of, when you're thinking about it, it's like an antivirus program, right? You stick it on your computer, it protects you, it's very defensive. Offensive cybersecurity, there's not like a really great definition, but I tried to put something together to just frame this out a little bit. And the way I think of it is it's deliberate use of cyber capabilities to disrupt, degrade, deny, destroy digital assets, infrastructure. And it is a bit about, action, preemptive or retaliatory, but really it's going beyond passive defense. It can involve any number of actors. Governments have a large presence in offensive cybersecurity. There's contractors, there's consultants, and it's complicated. That's why we're here today, to just talk about this a little bit. And so notably, one thing that I want to point out here is nothing about this definition says it's malicious, right? I often think of offensive cybersecurity as either a state actor going after someone and attacking, or a malicious actor going after and attacking, right? But what we're going to talk about today is, in some ways, the spectrum of offensive cybersecurity. And what I mean there is it becomes really difficult to think about this from a policy perspective because somewhere along this line is that we don't like you doing this border, right? And it's going to matter who the actor is, what the action is, who the target is, all of these things. And it means that like this big chunk in the middle is all dual use, which from a policy perspective becomes really difficult to regulate. Because good luck regulating intent, good luck regulating mistakes. All of this can be very difficult. And offensive cybersecurity operations are not rare. They're just not particularly publicized. Folks don't necessarily take credit for them. They don't kind of put out the report card at the end of the year and say, here's all the cool stuff we did. We do hear about offensive operations when they go big or when a target is particularly hit. But really, along this spectrum, we have passive defense. That's firewalls and antivirus. That's you saying, I put up a moat around my computer, I'm safe now. I don't have to worry about it. And that's fully lawful. No one disagrees about that. Anybody can like install their antivirus, pay the subscription, cool, we're good. Threat hunting. All right, now I'm going to go out and just watch the world. I'm going to collect information. I'm going to think about putting out maybe a honeypot. I'm going to understand what's going on around me, but I'm not necessarily going to do a lot with it. That's going to allow me to use passive defense more effectively. And that's generally considered legal as well. That's just watching, especially if you're on your own infrastructure. All right, active defense. What does that mean? Looking out and saying, like, I'm going to trace, I'm going to attribute, I'm going to think about what I can do to attackers that maybe aren't on my network. All right, that becomes really interesting, and that, from a legal and policy perspective, becomes a good question. At some point, we need to think about what, like, is beaconing malware good? Are we watermarking stolen files? Are we on our network watermarking our stuff so we can go find it later? Calling back to a domain that's controlled by an attacker. All right, offensive action. If I'm being attacked, should I take some action to stop that attack? That's a really interesting policy question. And it depends a little bit on jurisdiction. And so we're in the policy world, and it doesn't apply to cybersecurity particularly well. But this is really where we mostly see state actors, all the way up here. State actors do offensive action. Malicious actors disrupt and have sabotage, ransomware, disruption of critical infrastructure. And there's some mix of state and malicious actors and criminal actors in here. And this is one that is increasingly discussed by governments, and that is cyberkinetic action. And so that is the idea that you are the subject of a cyber attack, and you respond kinetically, i.e. with traditional implements of war and geopolitics. You'll note that somewhere around here I stopped talking about legality. All of this is a really interesting gray area, and the topic of a lot of discussion from governments broadly, from the US, from international organizations. We will talk about all of that. This is one that we see, interestingly, in a number of conflicts right now, where nation states use cybersecurity and offensive cybersecurity capabilities to support kinetic entry. And so, like, they disrupt the air defenses before they fly their planes in, right? And so it becomes part of an integrated operation. So we're talking a little bit already about who has the capabilities. A number of nation states have these capabilities. In the US, offensive cyber operations are distributed among a number of organizations. They don't tend to talk about their jobs very much, but they're really interesting. The Cyber Command, the US Cyber Command, does have capabilities around offensive cyber. and some norms of their own about how they use them. And they have doctrines in place. One's called defend forward. One's called persistent engagement. And that really frames the way that they use the capabilities. The NSA has tailored access operations. The CIA has their own covert cyber operations. Those are under different authorities. Title 10 for military, Title 50 for intelligence, and there's some other legal pieces that we'll talk about. But the really interesting thing is that both the new administration, the Trump administration, and governments around the world are starting to talk about what are the norms here? What should the rules be? Can we come together to put together some sort of understanding about how people use, conceptualize, think about, and place boundaries on these capabilities? So there are very, very different approaches, and I'll talk about a few. These are not necessarily 100% representative, but they are interesting case studies. Russia takes a very integrated approach. They put out aggressive disruption campaigns, and they're all integrated across other governmental goals. China's capabilities include a fair bit of pre-planning. They do a lot of pre-positioning and getting ready to make sure that they can do something later if they want to. But they also do data exfiltration. They do influence operations, and so they're very strategic, a little bit quieter. But you've seen a number of high-profile hacks from them recently, or actors associated with them in the form of various typhoons. And so they're becoming a little bit louder. Iran and North Korea both have some targeted cyber capabilities, sometimes disruption, sometimes talking about how do we influence the conversation that we don't like, and sometimes just looking for money, right? I think that there's been some analysis of North Korea's, the percentage of the money that comes in for them that is actually cyber operations is not trivial. So there's a lot of different incentives there, and a lot of different approaches. Are you proactive? Are you reactive? Are you setting the scene? Are you opportunistic? And so even among the major nation states, there's not kind of a consensus set of norms about how we do this. There are international norms and discussions happening. The one that I've been closest to is called the Pall Mall process. That was convened by the US, not the US, the US was not a convener, the UK and France, very specifically to talk about commercial cyber intrusion capabilities, CCICS. They are talking about buying spyware and surveillance software and hacking software, and what the rules should be for nation states. They put out a code of practice about how nation states should think about and approach these questions. Should you work with sketchy groups that go after human rights workers? Probably not. Should you have the capability to use responsible actors towards responsible government goals? Probably. That's kind of where they landed. Their next process is going to be looking at industry norms and industry code of practice. What does it mean to be a responsible player within the industry, creating these tools, selling these services, that kind of thing. There are also a number of treaties, international treaties. None of them really squarely address this, but there is a fair bit of discussion. A lot of the most recent cyber-related treaties are about cybercrime, and they're more about content. They're more about messaging and conspiracy. They're more about enforcement and collaboration on enforcement actions across governments. They're not talking about offensive cybersecurity in this way. So this leaves us in a world where offensive cybersecurity is real. Operations are happening all the time from all sorts of different actors. Legal and diplomatic mechanisms are playing catch up, hence why we have this conversation in DC and across the world. And states are actively defining their practices right now and iterating them before we really have strong principles. and certainly before we have public principles. I do think that there are principles in place that just, they're moving over time and they're evolving, but they're not published or anything. So there, it feels like there's a little bit of an imbalance, and we're going to have to catch up on the policy side. To the extent that we can. Policy, again, is designed to be slow. It's designed to be deliberative. It's designed to take some time so that we can't make rush judgments. So we'll see how this all goes. So let's talk about offensive operations. Here's some examples. I have asserted that they're happening all the time, and they are. Very few of them are this big. But just as some examples, who here knows about Stuxnet? Good, okay. It's like, is this too old? It's a really good example of an offensive cybersecurity operation, right? It targeted Iran's nuclear facility, and it just made a subtle tweak to the settings of the software so the centrifuges spun too fast and broke. Cool. I didn't wipe any data. I didn't steal any stuff, but I did a major disruption, caused physical damage, and kind of it entered the public knowledge. It was publicized. People wrote stories about it, and really, I think it was one of the first really public examples of this kind of operation, because it was like front page of New York Times, especially as people were trying to piece it together and figure out what happened. I don't believe anyone took credit for it, but if you look at any of these, some of the attribution is relatively easy to find. NotPetya, who's familiar with that one? All right, a little bit more obscure. But NotPetya looked like ransomware and was actually a wiper. So it looked like ransomware in that it encrypted your data, but it just wasn't actually decryptable. And so it was a very destructive tool. It was kind of disguised as a malicious operation, a criminal operation. And it was a strategic attack, and it went viral. Whether or not it was supposed to go viral is a bit of an open question. And there was significant collateral damage that folks do not believe was intended. So, SolarWinds, that one hit radars? A little bit? All right, so it's an espionage operation on the US government that exfiltrated a significant amount of data. One thing that I will note is both NotPetya and SolarWinds, I think, definitely SolarWinds, leverage update mechanisms. And so they poisoned an update for software that was already installed and got access into sensitive networks and data. It was stealthy. It was long-term. It was a supply chain compromise. They discovered it a little bit by accident, but they did get some really interesting data out of that. One of the observations I will put there is that it is really hard to secure something as big and sprawling as the US government. And so SolarWinds could take advantage of that. And the US government has a huge amount of really sensitive, really interesting data. And if you're an adversary, there's really, really strong incentives to go in and see if you can get it. If you can get it quietly, all the better, right? So SolarWinds almost did that. Cybercom and the Internet Research Agency. This one is a little bit different. Cybercom, during an election, took action to disrupt the operations of a Russian misinformation firm called the Internet Research Agency, largely seen as a state actor. But they took coordinated state action against a misinformation campaign and ran with it, right? So all of these are a little bit different, but they're all state actions or near state actions. The Internet Research Agency one was interesting. They disabled servers, they went in and disabled infrastructure, and reportedly did it all within the rules of cybercom and the rules of war and the rules of geopolitics and all of these things carefully balanced. But it's an example of hackback, which is a concept that we've been discussing for a long time in DC. If I'm attacked, am I allowed to attack back? And in terms of all of this mismatch between cyber and policy, it's real murky. And if you ask most companies, they don't want to hack back. That feels really fraught. We'll talk more about that. So anyway, these operations aren't theoretical. They tend to fall somewhere outside the traditional rules of engagement and can have really broad consequences. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the tools, because the operations are enabled by the tools. The tools are dual use, right? Metasploit is absolutely a defensive tool. It's also an offensive tool. The idea that you can go through and use this open source framework to do pen testing and training, you can build and test and evaluate and figure out how to protect yourself. But you can also use it to go figure out how you can attack someone else. Cobalt Strike, very similar. Adversary simulation features. How do I go figure out who's going to attack me and how? Awesome. Go play with it. Great. If you're using it to go figure out how to attack someone else, maybe we feel a little bit differently about it. And from the policy perspective, it's hard to untangle those two things. FinFisher is commercial spyware. And so like the Pall Mall process, thinking about what it looks like to have these surveillance capabilities, the ability to do device compromise and access to communications and data, and that is largely sold to governments. Eternal Blue, is anyone familiar with Eternal Blue? I find this one fascinating. This is actually what NotPetya was built on. It was an exploit framework that the NSA put together and leaked. Oops. And so you actually, I think I don't have this on a slide anymore, but you have this like progression between creating the tool and the capabilities, using it, losing it, and then this massive operation that hits and impacts a huge portion of the world. It was also used in WannaCry, and so these elite government capabilities can get out there. I think that there's, in this world, everybody wants everyone else's data, so some of it's going to get out there. And it also underwrites this idea that governments hoarding capabilities and hoarding vulnerabilities can have really interesting consequences for the world, and by interesting I mean bad. So these are dual-use tools. The tools themselves, you can think of them as neutral or not. They can be used for dual use. There is a global market for exploits and spyware, and a lot of really legitimate reasons to use them. US law enforcement is a part of this market, and they buy some of these exploits. If law enforcement wants to get into someone's phone, you saw this in some of the like encrypted device debates, is they'll go out and they'll pay someone to hack the phone. That feels reasonable, right? To have that capability. But I don't love it in other contexts. Oh no, dual use, what do we do from a policy perspective? Policy's bad at deeply confusing, like entangled things, especially when it's borderless and it's moving quickly. So we're still figuring out and thinking about how do you regulate dual-use tools. There are some treaties out there for things around security and dual-use tools. For example, the Wassenaar Agreement, which is this old agreement around dual-use technology, is really around military technologies, physical military technologies, but has been used in this context as well. So, but it begs the question, how do we deal with it? And how should governments deal with it? Do they regulate it? Do they disclose it? And what I mean by that is if if this happens to be a vulnerability in a widely used email program, should they keep it so they can use it later? Should they tell the email provider so they can fix it? Should they operationalize it first? And so there are really interesting questions there. The problem becomes very clear. You can't regulate purely by technical characteristics. The technical characteristics can be applied in any number of ways. A tool is a tool. You can use it in a lot of ways. If we regulated everything that could possibly be dangerous, we wouldn't drive cars. We wouldn't have televisions. We would, like, all of these things. Microwaves would definitely be a no-no. And so we have to think a little bit more creatively when it comes to cyber policy and offensive cyber policy. We can regulate code. That falls down. As the Wassenaar Agreement initially was one of the agreements that regulated export of encryption technologies. And some of the hackers got really grumpy about this, and they said, fine, you're not going to let me transmit the code? I will print it out and get on an airplane. And they did. Which, you know, that works for relatively small things like encryption keys, but export controls fall down too. Do you regulate intent? That's really, really hard. Oops, my ransomware turns out to be a wiper. That was a mistake, my bad. Or I wrote it for a class and it got out in the world. My bad, no intent. Do you regulate actors? And that's increasingly part of the discussion in DC and other capitals around the world. Do we want to think about how we provide authorities and protections for folks who are in this space and who are thinking about offensive security? And I did promise pirates. I also just really like this pirate in particular. He looks like he's, I don't know. It's Pirates of the Caribbean, but with computers. So, Letters of Marque. Letters of Marque are in the Constitution, and essentially they are a way for the US government to deputize private actors in a time of war. And it was very common in the US and in Europe, elsewhere, to essentially have mercenary privateers who had this letter, literally a physical letter, that said, I get to attack you and keep your stuff because you don't like my government, right? And you know, that worked well in the middle of chaotic wars. As things settled down, they decided it was fairly destabilizing and potentially not a good idea. And so there were a number of treaties put in place to end privateering. And they're largely specific to the context or naval warfare. But they're feeling very relevant. And Letters of Marque and these treaties are feeling very, very similar to the world that we live in, where offensive cyber operations are often carried out by proxy actors, who are sometimes state-supported, sometimes simply tolerated. And they're going out and they're doing these operations, you know, in coordination or not. But it begs the question, in some circles, should states deputize these offensive cyber actors? Should we essentially come up with a modern letter of marque that says, I am allowed to do this, and I am allowed to go back and attack? Let's see. There are plenty of folks who are kind of intentionally blurring that line, and there's nobody who's being super clear about it. There's no benefit to being super clear about it if you're one of these actors. And in the world of cybersecurity that is relatively opaque and relatively quiet and relatively behind the scenes, folks just aren't that interested in being big and bold and kind of marketing themselves, for lack of a better way of thinking about it. But if you're going to deputize offensive cyber actors, you have to think about accountability, and you have to think about impacts, and you have to think about the what next. And we're in the midst of a bit of a legal gray zone because this is simply moving so much faster than, I think, are you making faces at the clip art?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm not really sure what's happening there, but I liked it anyway. So there's big attribution questions. Cyber attacks are hard to attribute most of the time anyway, right? And if you're a particularly sophisticated attacker, it will often be impossible to actually figure it out. Attribution is often linguistic, right? You'll look at the code and you're like, oh, this is the word order you use. That looks a lot like this language. And so you can start to play back attribution, but it's real fuzzy. And there's a strategic shift towards decentralization. So you have, again, a bunch of different kinds of actors. You have state actors, you have proxy actors, you have private contractors, you have independent threat actors. Because I'm talking a lot about nation states here, but there's plenty of folks who are just out for themselves, and they fit into this framework somehow too. But if we are going to think about deputization, and we're going to think about decentralizing these kinds of operations, then you have to think about when is it an act of war? When is it a military action? And when is it criminal conduct? And when is it not? I don't think we have good answers for that. That's the spoiler. But it is part of the conversation right now as folks think about how we adapt some of our norms, some of our governance towards the cyber realm, right? It is part of our lives in a way that policy has not caught up with. I don't know whether students get phishing training emails, but it's just a fact of life now. Okay. I get emails at least once a month that are trying to get me to click. They're simulating phishing attacks. And then if I did click on it, it would pop something that says, "Aha, you fell for it." And I was telling Sid about one that was particularly good. I sit in the cybersecurity services group at a firm called Venable, and this particular phishing attack was, "Hey, we noticed that you have an insecure password. You should reset it." And so our entire group was like, okay, that sounds like a good idea. Bam. If that had been something that wasn't protected, that we didn't have the kind of active passive defense, that would not be great. This also becomes deeply politically sensitive when we're talking about attribution and we're talking about actors. There's a lot of information that goes into attribution. Again, it's hard. What if you get it wrong? How does that impact the legal landscape here? So let's talk a little bit about where the law sits right now. In the US, there again, I mentioned some of the military and intelligence groups. There are constraints put in place by the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is an old law about hacking. It is, I would argue, overbroad and lacks nuance in important ways, but it is the law we have. There are also authorities under Title 10 and Title 50 that provide authorities to go do the thing. CFA limits private actors and how they approach unauthorized access to systems. And it becomes really interesting to say, okay, when is this espionage? When is it disruption? When is it active defense? When is it passive defense? And going back to that spectrum, where do we decide things fall? And when are we okay with it? And what kinds of authorities need to be in place? What kinds of protections need to be in place for the people who are doing good things with it, but also big gray areas. Internationally, there aren't a lot of laws, and they are not well enforced. This is a pretty nascent space, and people are thinking deep thoughts about it and trying to figure out what those norms look like, and trying to figure out whether they're going to fragment by different kind of geopolitical blocks. So, but the outcome here is that, you know, U.S. companies, again, we're going to talk about hackback a little bit, if they're being attacked by a ransomware gang, they can't turn around and go hack that ransomware gang's infrastructure because of CFAA and the idea of unauthorized access. They can set up other things that kind of block the operation. They can disrupt it in some ways, but it is more of a gray area. And even some of the investigatory work, where you're just trying to figure out what's happening and where to look, can cross legal lines. So there are some, if any of you want to go to law school, but also care about cybersecurity, those lawyers have really interesting jobs. You know, they're the folks that the hackers go to and say, I want to do this, can I? And they say, I don't know. And then they'll go and they'll consult and they'll think real hard about it. They'll look back at the language of the law. They'll look at precedent and they'll come up with an answer. And the answer, by the way, is often, you can't do it that way, but you can do something similar. And so there's some creative thinking to it as well. So let's talk a little bit about what happens if we deputize actors to essentially become part of a state operation. Private actors become state actors. What does that mean? There's a whole different set of rules about how you interface with other countries and other countries' governments. Say I am the security analyst at a company who gets permission to go hack back against the ransomware gang. And the country that happens to be tolerating, sanctioning them gets mad. Am I a government actor? I might be. I don't love that outcome. I personally would not want to be in that seat. But it can also create escalation. What if we take a cyber operation and it escalates to kinetic? It escalates to something that is causing physical harm, right? But also, what if we're escalating to a cyber operation that is so impactful that it's way worse than kinetic? We start to see that kind of interaction and that back and forth. There can be diplomatic fallout. So if I'm a private actor and I'm going out and I'm deputized, I have my letter of marque, I'm a cyber pirate, I can't go call up my counterparts in the other government, right? There are diplomatic channels for official operations now. They're not widely talked about. Nobody wants to say they have them. But folks can kind of de-escalate. You can't do that if you're a private actor. And there's an interesting conflict of interest. Say I am, again, that security analyst who's going to go back and hack back. But my company really wants the intellectual property of the other guys. If I'm going to go and do this offensive action, do I just take their stuff? Is there a competitive advantage in that for me? Is there a business interest that suddenly enters the fray in the kind of diplomatic or military operation that we like to think of as not business-oriented? It becomes, again, really interesting questions. You'll note that I don't have answers to any of these questions. I am raising them, and I would love your take on it in just a couple minutes. But we've essentially created a world where strategic ambiguity is policy. I don't think that lasts for that much longer. As a side note, none of these image AI things are good at letters. Question mark was actually really hard. But so governments are thinking about this. How do we create plausible deniability? How do we preserve flexibility? How do we preserve optionality? How do we deter escalation? And do we want to put norms in place, either to make it really clear how we're using these capabilities and what our rules are about them, or to really just say it's open season. Go do your thing, think about it, figure out what you're going to do, and we go do your thing, and we don't really care what you're doing. And some governments have taken that approach. Some governments have been a little bit less flexible. So essentially, offensive cybersecurity is a bit seductive, especially right now, as folks are looking at an increasingly volatile online ecosystem with plenty of actors who are out there to steal some money or some credentials, and then all the way escalating up to nation-state operations. We're going to have to think about the policy frameworks that are lagging, and the places where where existing policy frameworks around operations that aren't just about cyber don't work in this context. And we're going to have to think about whether we want that strategic ambiguity or not. And I will say, as someone who works with a lot of companies and a lot of industry members, ambiguity is not helpful for those actors, right? People want to know what they're allowed to do. They want their lawyers, when they go to, hello, my hacker lawyer, can I go do this thing? They want to know whether they can do it or whether they shouldn't do it, or who they can ask for help. So it is a moment for thinking about cross-disciplinary governance. It's a moment for thinking about what we want those norms to be, how we want industry to act, how we want hackers to act, how we want governments to act, how we want all of these actors to sit down together in this ecosystem and do offensive security, whatever that means. So I have no grand conclusion, but I'd be interested in questions and your thoughts and discussions, whether there's anything here I missed, any implications.
All right. Join me in thanking Heather for her talk. We do have some time for questions.
I see you first, and then you.
So this whole thing has been about specifically offensive cybersecurity,
Yes.
right? But some of the offensive ops that you've listed, like Stuxnet or something, are cases where that seems like it's honestly like kinetic to cyber, not
Yep.
cyber as a kinetic event. I mean,
The intention, like the goal was kinetic, right? The goal was physical, but the operation was cybersecurity, was cyber.
So does cybersecurity not mean defending against a cyber threat? Like in the first, so in the long list at the beginning, it's like the spectrum from firewalls,
Yeah.
threat sniffing or threat hunting, active defense. Those are all clearly like, its instigation is a cyber attack that you're trying to defend against. That's what makes it cybersecurity. But as you move closer towards sabotage or something, it's more sounding to me like it's a physical threat, and
It moves in.
cybersecurity is a cyber attack.
Yeah.
It's not even like you're defending against a cyber threat.
It is a cyber threat with physical ramifications, right? Same if someone goes after the electrical grid. That's a cyber attack and a cyber threat, but the impact can be much, much broader than just cyber. We are long past the world where cyber and the digital realm was kind of disconnected from the rest of us. The number of connected things that are in my home, like on my body too, actually. The lines are so muddled. I tend to think about it as the attack is code, right?
It's like a nuke, but it's like Iranian nuclear development.
Yep.
That's not a cyber attack that you're defending against.
But the attack was cyber. The impact wasn't.
The defense was cyber, wasn't it? Isn't Stuxnet a U.S. or like Israel a U.S. offense?
Yeah.
Cyber offense.
Yep.
Allegedly. Okay.
Allegedly. Nobody took credit, surprisingly.
But the instigation is never cyber. The instigation is a physical.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying.
It's not like you're.
Yeah, the cyber,
security in the sense that you're.
cyber is the tool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's cyber attack.
It's a cyber attack. It's an offensive cyber attack.
And this is a presentation on offensive cybersecurity. I don't know. I
Yeah,
think the line is kind of hard for me to digest. What makes it cybersecurity if you did the cyber when you're offensive?
It is a hard line, actually, and I think part of this is about the difficulty of drawing that line. So you're completely right. Is it defensive? Is it active? Is it offensive? Like there is a spectrum here, and actually, this spectrum started out as 3 dots, and then I just kept going, right? So, but you're not wrong.
You kind of discussed it a little bit about like government interference.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, what's your personal conviction on the idea of do we need more or less government within like, the laws? I guess you kind of talk about the gray lines.
The gray areas. I think we need better involvement and better regulation. I think we need more thoughtful and nuanced regulation, which is unfortunately really difficult.
Yeah.
I do tend to like some of the Pall Mall code of practice, where you bring together a large group, it's multi-stakeholder, everybody is heard, even if they're not super happy with the outcome. In my role with Hacking Policy Council, part of what we do is try to come up with, here's what the conventional wisdom is among industry, so that we can help people understand it, and they can make better decisions from the government side. I am personally happiest when we have nuanced, well-informed policy. That is a high bar.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is helping policymakers understand the implications, and that's a lot of metaphors, and a lot of explaining things in a way that your professors never will, because it just has to hit home in a different way. Everybody here has got some techie background in a way that I think we have one coder in Congress, maybe? One. It's not great.
All right, I heard the bell ring, so I think we need to cut off here. Thank you very much for attending. Let's thank everyone one more time.
Thank you.